Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. So glad to have you guys here with us live. And of course, happy for the people that will be doing a rewatch. And of course, people that will be listening to this on the audio-only podcast that will drop Monday. So before we start, if you're new to the channel, please hit that like button, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, as we're constantly doing cross streams with other channels and adding new shows. Speaking of new shows, yesterday I once again gentrified White Guy Wednesday, this time with host of Parallax Views, JG Michael. We had a fun discussion about an underrated classic, Psycho 2, kind of its importance. And also we talked a little bit about the follow-up Psycho 3, the Anthony Hopkins directed follow-up Psycho 3. And then with the viewers in the chat, we took a deep dive into our unironic love for B-movie cinema. It was a good time, and that show is up. So whenever you're done here, you should definitely check that out. As always, thank you to the subscribers on YouTube and Twitch and all the other audio-only podcast formats where you find us. And of course, thank you to the patrons. Collectively, you are all the fuel in the engine that keeps TIR moving along. So if you're enjoying what we do here and want access to the post-show champagne room, which we will be going into this evening, there's only one way: become a patron for as little as $3 a month, $30 for the year. It can all be yours. You can be part of the live virtual audience for the Prescod hosted Mau Hour. And of course, you can join us for our monthly movie nights, where I believe, I don't know if it's up today, if it's going up tomorrow, but MT is putting up a post asking people what they want to see for the next movie night. She's going to give you a few options, so I'm excited for that. Now, let me bring in the crew. Coming all the way from Miami, Florida, where the hurricanes are demolishing Bethune-Cookman, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. I have a suggestion for movie night.
Okay. Sure.
I think we should go black exploitation.
We did Willie Dynamite, which still has the greatest scene ever when he goes down those stairs. One of the best scenes in cinema history. Have we done it? Oh, we did Fear of a Black Hat. Which it got nominated. It's something. It's doing something's happened with the Fear of a Black Hat. I forget, something really important has happened in that movie. Somebody messaged me about it and said TIR once again is ahead of the curve. So which one are you thinking for black exploitation?
In order to illustrate our solidarity with labor and the exploitation of labor, I think we should show the Mac.
Oh God. Well, I'm of course down with that because that is an Oakland, California staple.
Yes, it is.
Definitely point out some. Hey, I know that. There's one person that can put it to a vote, and that's MT. She does the community posts, and she also does the posts in the Discord. If you guys don't know, she's always lurking around in there. Let's bring her on the screen as well. MT Toussaint.
Hello. We love voting. Voting is good.
Peace, greetings, and salutations.
Hello, Mr. Robert.
Toussaint. What is your take on watching the Mac on TIR? I mean, I'm all for it.
I've heard of it, and I've seen that guy Julian in like Jay-Z videos.
You've heard of it?
You've never seen the Mac?
I've never seen the Mac.
Is it because you're only 28?
You don't know about the famous pool table scene?
Ooh.
She wouldn't know any
No.
scene.
Shade tree, nigga. You a rest haven for hoes. You a car thief. But the wind you got outside is hot right now. You ain't no pimp.
Wow.
There's part of me that thinks it'd be kind of good to because again, I watched that movie. I remember renting it when I was about 12, 13. Because I'd heard so much about it, and
Inappropriate.
I cut school and used my lunch money to rent that movie and watched it and coffee at home.
Were you ever in school?
No. My 8th grade year, because my mom had a really funky work schedule, and so she was just gone, and I was like, all right.
He wasn't gutting in high school, I can tell you that. Went to that bougie ass high school in Oakland.
In Albany, school in Albany, California.
Albany School for Stars.
Alabaster preppy kids.
I don't know if they were preppy. I don't know if we had preps. Remember, it's outside of Berkeley, so it's a little different. Whatever. It's not where you went, so it's different.
Catholic school.
Yeah, it's not like that. We don't have, nobody is a preppy. Was a bad thing.
I was in high school in the 80s. Everybody was preppy in the 80s.
So you're telling me there's a picture of you somewhere with your polo shirt,
with a Latigra shirt,
and
a leather tie? Yes, I used to wear.
I was going to say Lacoste.
I used to have Latigra shirts with leather ties. Yes.
Who do we have to bribe to get one of those and make it like have Quinn do something?
I have high school yearbook pictures of me wearing Latigra shirts and leather tie.
Did you have a part right here?
No, I didn't. I had a short afro, which was actually an official haircut style.
You didn't have a shag.
I had a shag my senior year in high school. Shags were big in '86. I remember wearing. You remember Shams DeBaron shirts?
No. What is that, Tucson? What is that? You're the fashion expert.
I don't know what that is. That's not in the book.
Shams DeBaron shirts were shirts that were very big, particularly in like the hip hop kind of vibe. They were like these dress shirts that had little silk designs on them. See if we can still find it. Google Shams DeBaron. Shams DeBaron shirts, Lee pants or jeans, and British Knights or British Walkers.
So you didn't have Air Jordans?
There were no Air Jordans in it. The first Air Jordans came out when I was in high school.
86, right?
Yeah. But
Paul should know that because all young people are sneakerheads.
British Walkers was really big.
Paul's face is like, I don't know what the fuck you talking about. You think my Jamaican daddy bought me Jordans? No, Paul's not Jamaican. Paul's another
Bayesian.
He's another. Once again, there can be only one. Island Negroes again. Totally forgot Paul is Island Negro.
Oh, there's a T. As a matter of fact, YouTube has a commercial. Shams DeBaron commercial.
Oh my god,
too much fun. Look, all the fun has to stop because much like the show we did Tuesday, this is going to be another serious show that I'm sure people are going to have a lot to chime in on. This year marked 60 years since the March on Washington, and there is a bipartisan acceptance of the event as a monumental step forward for Black Americans for their struggle for civil rights. While Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic speech for many is understood as a call for collective understanding to get beyond racial differences and come together as one united nation, that wasn't the ultimate goal of the march. Its organizers had a socialist democratic vision of massive economic redistribution of wealth. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom became a victory for the civil rights movement and its leaders, but was it truly a success? A Black political buffer class is established at this moment, but did that class disenfranchise their base by not fighting for universal jobs and housing programs and instead accepting the Great Society narrative? The problem with poor Blacks was an issue of moral character. Well, we have our Sometimes Why Paul Prescod on to discuss. You can read Paul's latest in Jacobin titled The March on Washington Advanced a Radical Vision for Society That Remains Unfulfilled. Wherever you are watching or listening to this, there should be links in the description to that piece. Please welcome, coming all the way live from Philly, Fly Eagle Fly, Paul Prescod.
I was going to say, you know how much I love you all. I'm missing the Eagles game right now. So
that's real love, and
Oh.
that's really what we need to let people know, that the Eagles are on right now against the Vikings.
the Vikings, and we just went up 3. So
It's a big game as they barely beat the New England Patriots.
The Eagles barely beat the Patriots?
we were a little rusty, but we didn't play our starters preseason, so we'll be all right.
You got the rent money riding on this?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the outcome, I might be streaming from the sidewalk.
You're breaking the
Pascal.
caps.
So originally, Pascal wanted to play this Malcolm X speech excerpt that would have, I think it might have derailed the conversation a little bit, because it's an 8-minute, first of all, it's 8 minutes. And second of all, I think where there's definitely parts of it that we all agree on, because of the rhetoric, I think we would have had to kind of explain the rhetoric a little too much. So instead, Pascal has a barrage of questions for you.
Can I ask the first question?
Oh my goodness.
I want to ask the first question.
Really, ladies first.
Rock on, Kimosabi.
Oh my goodness. Nikki D, you really want to ask the first question?
Yeah, man. First question.
Go for
First question, Paul. We know that you like to rain on Black people's parades. We know that you're a hater. You took Marcus Garvey away from us, out of the pantheon of heroes. Are you trying to take the March on Washington away from us? Do you hate it too?
And that's your question.
That's your
Pascal's like, you went first for this? No, I mean, I think a close read of the piece was definitely not that. I think there's a lot to praise in the March on Washington. And I think part of my point was, like, it's much more radical than it's given credit for, even though it's praised almost universally. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I would bet Donald Trump, George W. Bush, Ron DeSantis, as well as, of course, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, would all praise the March on Washington. And they would all, of course, praise the I Have a Dream speech. But I think part of my point was, like, actually its roots were much more radical. Its goals were way more radical than, it's given credit for. But it also, it had its limits, as even the organizers of the march at the time understood it had its limits at the time.
Well, you just said something very interesting, Paul, because I would make the retort that the fact that Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden will all love the March on Washington typifies what the problem was with the March on Washington.
Well, but I think that kind of always happens, though. I mean, there's plenty of, genuinely radical, whether it's figures or movements that, this always happens. It kind of gets caught. I think Lenin had some quote about, all revolutionaries eventually are going to be like a postage stamp. I forget who said that, but I don't think that in itself is proof of, something being not really radical or whatever it is. Because I think that process happens all the time of things getting co-opted by the ruling class, or now that we're a safe distance away, we can look at it and say, oh, it was so great. But at the time, President Kennedy, the whole administration was terrified of the march. They thought it was going to be a riot. They were trying to stop it. At the time, it was a radical thing to do. Now there's probably a march on Washington every weekend.
Well, we're going to get there, brother.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get there.
Well, the Million Man March, there's definitely a lot of black right wingers at the Million.
Yeah, but at that time, people weren't really marching on Washington. Like, it was kind of a new thing, But yeah, maybe I'm going ahead. But I don't think the fact that today it's kind of been co-opted, so-called. I think that just kind of happens all the time with people, with events. Unfortunately, I don't think that in itself is evidence of something being, milquetoast. And that's kind of what I try to go into this article. You look at their demands, the coalition that was built, it was actually quite. Can
you talk a little bit about that, like the kind of the beginnings of what the march was supposed to be and the demands, and also the behind the scenes struggles of Bayard Rustin and Asa Randolph. There's a movie that's coming out about Rustin. And I think one of the things we do
I'm
on this
looking forward
show
to it.
is also, talk about these people's legacies, because a lot of times people are just remembered for their worst day, right? So Rustin is going to be forever remembered in a lot of people's eyes as some sort of turncoat. I think the drama behind him being gay is going to be one of the big features of the documentary about his life, which we'll see if it takes away from the story of what he was able to accomplish. Also, we saw with Judas and the Black Messiah, kind of reification of the great man of history narrative that you see with Fred Hampton, which takes away from kind of even what people like the Panthers as a group were trying to do. So what was going on behind the scenes in the March on Washington, which for a lot of people is just the story of King's speech,
Right.
and not even these organizing efforts that had a much grander vision, as you write about in your piece, of social democracy and not one of racial democracy.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because, when the march was originally conceived, if you go way back to the early 1940s, A. Philip Randolph had built a March on Washington movement for, jobs, ending discrimination and employment in the defense industry. Also, originally the demand was around desegregating the armed forces, but mainly about jobs. Threaten the March was actually building a movement. They were touring the country, having rallies with Black workers. Roosevelt was terrified. They eventually got the Fair Employment Practices Commission in 1941, and they called off the march. So that was kind of the first iteration of that march. And so Randolph and Rustin then, fast forward 20 years later in the early 60s, start talking about this idea again. And in the first conception, it was actually almost purely supposed to be a march for jobs. There really wasn't much about civil rights per se in it. And Rustin's framing of that was, there really has been no legislation, no movement to address the economic condition of Black workers in this country for a very long time. So that was kind of really the first impetus. And I think even though at that stage, they had not won civil rights legislation, obviously this was before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, people like Rustin and Randolph, and I think even King, maybe to a lesser degree, they already were seeing the writing on the wall and seeing that, when we win civil rights legislation, we're going to now face a new problem. Getting this legislation is not going to fix some of the fundamental problems in our economy and the position of Black workers in that economy. So at first, it was really a kind of like, this is a march for jobs. And, it kind of was hard to get traction at first for various reasons. They wanted a broad front, so they wanted all the major civil rights organizations, NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Council, Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Urban League, so as any organizer knows, the bigger the coalition, the harder to keep it together. Personal rivalries, ego, all that stuff they were contending with. But so, it was kind of slow going. And it really, what changed the momentum was Birmingham. They're, especially the Southern Christian Leadership Council, struggling in Birmingham, fighting discrimination. We've all seen the images, the hoses, hosing down children, the German Shepherd dogs, the police. So, and that was a deliberate tactic. We probably don't have time to get into all of this, but like a big part of the civil rights movement's approach was getting media attention. And as I know, Pascal, you always talk about this is also playing into Cold War aims of essentially, can we embarrass the United States vis-a-vis communism? So, their decision to use children in the march in Birmingham and the reaction from Bull Connor, the police chief, this is what created a national crisis. And, Kennedy convenes meetings, and then all of a sudden there's civil rights legislation at the table. And now the march is tied to some real stakes. It's not just a march to have a march, but they kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel of civil rights legislation. So that's when they incorporate more civil rights emphasis, but it still, to me, didn't take away from its radical nature. And, one of the things I love to do is, just look at pictures from the March on Washington, and especially look at the picket signs. And you'll see, if anything, more of the picket signs have slogans related to economic demands and civil rights. All these signs about full employment, raising the minimum wage, Fair Employment Practices Commission, universal housing, education, and my absolute favorite sign from the march is one that says civil rights plus full employment equals freedom. And I think that really sums up the march. So in addition to the civil rights demands that they had, really prominently was essentially full employment, jobs for everyone who was able to work. And that was radical. I mean, it pushed against the idea that was already set even then that, full employment would cause inflation. We can't have that. We got to keep it at somewhere around, like 3 to 4% unemployment. So full employment was a big job. A permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was one in the 40s, but then it went away. Universal housing, a big part of that. Raising the minimum wage substantially. These were all parts of the demands. And now eventually, years later, they would come up with a freedom budget, which was more comprehensive and more radical. But, they were already hinting at it in this march. So I think their economic demands were actually much more radical than is given credit for. And I think it's revealing that, their civil rights demands were fulfilled, at least legally, but they didn't touch really the economic demands. And they would, keep fighting for those, but those were never really fulfilled. But if you think about what they were fighting for, the kind of coalition, it was really anchored in the union movement, United Auto Workers, electrical workers, packing house workers. You see their signs everywhere. If you look at pictures, they also helped to fund the march to a large degree. And a lot of them were Black trade unionists doing this. So, I think when you look at that economic dimension, it was much more radical than just, I have a dream. And it's kind of funny because I think even that speech, that doesn't do King's politics justice at all. I mean, he had already by that time had a big economic focus, was very active with unions and all that. And Adolph Reed tells a story. I forget if it was someone he knew personally or a contact of his, but these Black trade unionists who went to the march and they left early because King spoke at the end, and they left early and they were like, I don't want to hear that preacher shit, whatever. I came to hear like Randolph and everyone else. But even at the time, it wasn't kind of the King show. Life magazine after the march came out with an article, and Rustin and Randolph were on the cover. Not much about King. I think it's only been as time's gone on, it's kind of been framed as like it was all about Martin Luther King. But I mean, he was one speaker of many. He wasn't really a central organizer of the march per se. So that's kind of just gotten changed as time goes on.
Also, taking out that end part of the speech and have that be kind of everything of that speech, not the beginning part of the speech where he talks about if we're just here to, march and yell and hold signs and really nothing's ever going to change or happen. Eliminating the whole first part of that speech and leaving it the last stanza really also neuters, I think, everything he tries to say and kind of makes the movement almost more about respectability than it is about anything.
Right. And I was going to say too, I think, part of, the myth of like, oh, this was just like a liberal moderate march. I think part of that is the aesthetics. Like, yeah, people are in suits. There's nice church ladies. You look at it. Of course, it was nonviolent, and it kind of just seems like milquetoast.
It's but a different time.
Yeah, right. Different time. First
Sports
of all,
merchandising hasn't proliferated into the populace to the point where the way these people are dressed is the way people dress to do several things. If you were going on a train, if you're going on an airplane, or if you were going to a sporting event in 1963, odds are you had a suit on.
Right. You're going to class.
Church, whatever.
When Pascal was in high school, he had a suit on.
No, I did not.
So, but and the thing is, even Rustin and Randolph themselves, they saw the March too as like, this is a launching off point. This is not. I think I say in the piece, it's framed now as like the mission accomplished of the civil rights. Like, said, I have a dream. They passed the Civil Rights Act. Everything's good. But Rustin and Randolph were kind of looking at this is kind of a pivot point to take this movement to start looking at more fundamental economic problems, which are going to be much harder to solve and to fight for. Rustin used to joke that the only thing you really needed to fight segregation is bravery, yes, and like a tough ass, because you just got to sit down, essentially. Like, they basically would say all these preachers, like, they just knew how to sit down, and that's not necessarily an insult, but it's just saying, like, it's kind of a simpler tactic. And it's a much more clear aim. But now when you're getting to the stage of like, how do we actually fight for full employment when, we have automation and offshoring. How do we get universal housing? That's a much more kind of complicated situation that they were trying to point towards. And the march itself was, trying to project that both in its demands, but also in the coalition. I mean, they were always maintaining, like, we got to maintain a broad multiracial coalition, and there's got to be anchored in unions. And I think the march itself kind of reflected that coalition.
Well, I'd like to ask my question, which is a little maybe off the beaten path, if we will. So, Paul, what do you make of the arguments made by people like Malcolm X that the March on Washington, or Farce on Washington, as he called it, was a consequence of the civil rights establishment of that time starting to lose control of more militant elements of the protest movement, and that Kennedy reluctantly used the Big Six of the civil rights movement to paint a more moderate face on the whole event?
Explain who the Big Six are. You can't just name
the Big Six were the leaders of the major six civil rights organizations, which were Martin Luther King, Roy Wilkins, Foreman from CORE, from the Urban League. You had what's the name of the brother with the wavy hair from
Wilkins.
Wilkins was the NAACP. You had Whitney Young from the Urban League. How many people? How is that so far? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 4. And there's 2 more. Who are 2 from the Big Six?
I think Randolph is part of it.
Randolph was one of the Big Six. And I think Bayard Rustin might be one of the Big Six too. Is Bayard Rustin one of the Big Six?
Was it? Yeah, I'm forgetting. But you got most of it. Yeah. So I mean, in response to that, I guess first of all, at least the literature I've seen and shows that, in terms of the day-to-day organizing and bringing it together, those organizations were it. And maybe John Lewis is the last one from SNCC. Those organizations represented by the Big Six were the organizers of the march that brought it together, and unions, but, and actually, especially NAACP, credit has to be given where it's due. They had the biggest base and constituency, and they really got a lot of people to the march, in addition to unions. And every group played its role. But what I would say is, where is this like more radical element that was
actually SNCC in the 60s was actually disagreeing with the SCLC and the Urban League on tactics. They were actually considered much more militant. As a matter of fact, the sister who was in Columbia, Maryland, what was the name of the sister who stood up to the police in Columbia, Maryland? She's the famous picture where she puts the hand on the bayonet.
I forget her name. Yeah. Well, yeah, they're one element of the coalition, but I don't see much evidence that, there was this like throb.
No, he's not making. If you listen to the actual, I know we couldn't get the audio. He's not making an argument that they were going to launch their own march on Washington. What he's saying is that there were rumblings in the more radical elements of the civil rights coterie who were interested in moving beyond the traditional kind of politics and wanted, after Birmingham, because Birmingham was the flashpoint, after the outrage of Birmingham, wanted a more militant expression. Notice I said militant and not radical, because there's a difference between both words. Right. They want, because when radical assumes that they were like, well, they want socialism, they want communism. I'm not making that argument. When I mean militant, they wanted a more aggressive demonstration of the anger of many people who were in these marches that were getting abused, particularly in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And part of the angst that Kennedy had is because he believed that after Birmingham, if he let Black people march in D.C., that there could be violence.
Right.
And the argument that Malcolm X is making is that these, he speaks very pejoratively. Mm-hmm. Frankly, he speaks of the Big Six the same way we speak of the Black political class today. Mm-hmm. I would actually make the argument that the Big Six were the Black political class of their time, to be very honest. That, that they were basically going up to the big house to take orders to calm the Negroes down. And he also makes the allegation that they got large corporate patronage in a united fund of civil rights, a nonprofit fund, where they were paid off well to the sum of $800 million for carrying off that march.
So, I mean, that part about the fund, I don't know as much about. I'm not saying it's not true, but I don't know as much about. So, where to start? Well, yeah, I mean, the original plan too actually was, so Rustin's original plan was for 2 days. One would be like more aggressive lobbying, and then one for a march, and that was, kind of whittled down over time. But I mean, I think one thing to consider, and this is the thing Rustin and others have to consider, is like, how do you maintain the broad coalition, and what compromise can you and can you not make? And it is a very difficult question. I don't think there's like a manual you can just consult on those things, but I think it does beg the question: would you? And again, thinking about what the goals were. I mean, again, there were kind of two goals. There was the more limited short-term goal of like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then the bigger transformation. But I think for both of those goals is like, would you rather have almost 400,000 people there showing majoritarian support, or if it was going to be something, I mean, it's a little vague, like hyper militant. I mean, I don't know, who knows exactly what they had in mind, in terms of the SNCC forces per se, with only 30,000. Would that have been able to pass the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, or lead to that? And also, would it lead to the broader transformation? I don't think so.
Well, I don't know. You're prescient because you're taking me to my second question.
Also on the funding though, and of course he didn't live to see these developments, but Malcolm X didn't live to see these developments. But like, we want to talk about foundation funding, let's start talking about some of these Black Power groups in the late 60s.
True. I mean,
Malcolm X didn't know that at the time.
He didn't live to see that, but a good book on that matter. We talked about it before on the show. Top Down by Karen Ferguson talks about how the Ford Foundation was lining the pockets of many of the radical Black nationalist groups. But again, to the credit of many of the Black Powerites of that time, if you read what's that book, the famous book by Robert Allen, Black Awakening and the Capitalist Capitalist, yeah, he talks about that. He exposes the fact that one of the problems that we have is that the Ford Foundation is trying to line our pockets with foundation money. But let me tell you something. I don't bring this all up to say that I agree with Malcolm that the march was a waste of time. I don't agree with that. I also agree that I believe that if we sat Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph down in the room, they would, which they said themselves, they were like, yeah, that was not the end all and be all that needed to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And as you sat in your piece, they recognized that this is going to be racial democracy. In other words, it's going to be it's going to be a coup d'etat for the Black middle class, and the Black proletariats and the Black lumpen are going to get ungats.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's part of why, they wanted to emphasize the economic class part so much of the march. But of course, again, the racial democracy part was easier to win, and they did win that. And of course, that was important. But, again, then it sets the stage for the bigger fight over the freedom budget and all of that, which of course,
but I want to ask this question to Pascal, who wants to invoke the name of Malcolm X in this. To that point, that the economic part of what they wanted was kind of the major part, and sadly didn't get it. Malcolm X was kind of asking for nothing.
He wasn't. He was a
his whole time. Just a lot of.
And I would, and I mean, I don't want to go down this road because I'm starting to denigrate Malcolm X, but I mean, I just am imagining if I was a civil rights activist at that time, and you have someone like Malcolm X, you're as a civil rights activist risking your life for these kinds of things, whether it's for the racial democracy or the economic stuff, and there was some strategy there, and to listen to someone berate you, who is, essentially saying don't engage in the political system and has no strategy. I mean, just no effective strategy.
Well,
it's like what I wanted to ask you, Pascal, was ultimately, let's just say Malcolm X was able to get his own march on Washington. What would he have asked for beyond Black capitalism?
Well, that's a very good question. I will make the argument that based on where he was at the time, and as we were talking about earlier, Jason,
Mhm.
Malcolm X before Hodge and Malcolm X after Hodge are two different people in terms
Totally
of
different
politics.
guy.
And here's one thing too. Even after Hodge, I mean, when he formed, Organization of African
African-American
Unity,
unity.
right? The main project he was engaged in, I would argue, was quite a really kind of milquetoast liberal project. I mean, it was something around getting the UN to recognize human rights.
I mean, understand something. Understand
So
something.
I question that too about how radical. It's
by no stretch. Listen, let's make this clear, right? By no stretch of the imagination am I a Malcolm X fetishist at all. All right?
Yeah.
I am. Let's make this clear. All icons are up for grabs, black, white, or otherwise.
Right.
Otherwise, where I come from, all of them. Right? Let's make this abundantly clear. Right? No one is holy grail, none. So, but what I'm trying to say though is that the larger. First of all, let me answer the questions that Jason had. I totally agree with you. Nation of Islam, Malcolm X would have at best asked for business concessions, block grants, or some form of trickle-down black capitalism, because conservative black nationalism at that time has always been about nothing but a mixture of black capitalism and racial uplift politics. You know what I'm saying? And respectability politics. No question about that. I would also argue that if you look at post-Hodge Malcolm X, one of the things that he clearly demonstrates is he's moving closer and closer to SNCC and the traditional traditional civil rights organizations at the time. So there had to be a realization in his mind that there's no reason to be alienating these people who have been engaging with the state and empire traditionally through the traditional civil rights movement, as he was before, simply throwing grenades, without any kind of, true mobilization. I also will agree with Paul that though I am, an internationalist, Pan-Africanist, and so on and so forth, those ideologies which really come out of feeling the blowback from Pan-African liberation movements going on with Nkrumah and all that stuff, and also you have Fanon, and there was a cultural movement going on in the black diaspora around supporting these African liberation movements. Combine that with the fact that Malcolm goes throughout Africa and meets these leaders, so he's resplendent with the energy of what's going on in post-colonial Africa. So I understand what's happening, but I also will agree that it's a fair critique to ask, what are the practical meat and potatoes? Someone needs a job and to be able to get housing, ramifications of that politics for poor and working class black people. That's a fair question.
And just two things I want to say. I mean, one of them, I'll just criticize Malcolm X again one more time, but then
That's done.
I mean, and this is another just point of, just what you said, Pascal. I mean, I feel like Malcolm X is gets worshipped as a hero and just very little kind of critique.
Thanks, Spike Lee.
Right, but because by the end of his life, he, unless I'm mistaken, went to Selma at least at one point.
He went to Selma to basically show his support. Don't forget, Selma is controlled by SNCC. But he went to Selma when Martin Luther King was in prison.
Right.
He meets with Coretta Scott King, and he gives a very famous speech, which you can get on YouTube.
But that's actually my point. Again, I'm just saying, I'm just thinking, if I was I've been engaged in the civil rights movement since 1960. And now, Malcolm X has reached that point at the end of his life, which I'm glad he did. But it's kind of all right, welcome to the party, motherfucker. For years you've been denouncing us, and now at the end of your life you've reached this point. Why is he getting so much credit as opposed to the people who've kind of been there? Well, anyway, that's just a random frustration point.
I understand, and I can say as someone who personally, I don't think anyone was as steeped in black nationalist ideology as I was at one point in my life, or someone who was personally as affected by Malcolm X as I definitely was at one point. I still admire Malcolm for many reasons, particularly as a Muslim. He's very respected in the Muslim community. But the point I'm trying to say is that the power of Malcolm X is his rhetorical confrontation with the racist apartheid regime of America, which is very compelling. I understand why a 19-year-old kid in college at a PWI, a predominantly white institution, who is feeling alienated, gets excited when he hears Malcolm X speeches.
And that actually
I was that kid.
Mm-hmm. And that actually gets to the other point was, and this is something I know Rustin said in a few articles, was
they debated each other at one time.
Right. Yeah. And you can find that on YouTube as well. But he said, despite all the, extreme disagreements, essentially almost polar opposite politics, what Rustin said was, despite all that, Malcolm and many Black nationalists, they are reaching, the Black urban proletariat in a way that we are not able to.
That's true.
They're speaking to them and they're reaching them, and they were actually doing their own form of organizing. Maybe not the organizing we would want, but in the sense of building up the mosque, building up Nation of Islam, it was a form of organization. And I think part of it speaks to what you said earlier, Pascal, is that even people like Randolph and Rustin, who I would argue are, had a socialist perspective, were radicals, but they were kind of part of a political class. And at a certain point, they were kind of seen as like they're the middle class, political class, and they kind of lost this ability to speak to the Black urban poor in many ways, and that was kind of a dilemma. But he acknowledged that Malcolm's able to speak to them and resonate in a way that we are failing to at this point.
Let me tell you something.
Mid-60s.
I'm going to keep it. That's a great. I thank you for making that statement, Paul. Personally, you are always with the smart retorts. But let me tell you something. I think Jason may agree with me, whether we like it or not. And I'm not a fan of it. I've had whole shows criticizing them. I've had shows, podcasts criticizing Black nationalism as a form of Black nationalism. Let me tell you something. Black nationalism is profoundly compelling to poor and working class Black people, and that's a fact. Whether we like it or not. It is. And one of the things that can never be denied, it's not a political ideology that enters into the Black community top down. In other words, it's not particularly a creation or machination of white elites with a Black political class. Now, we can make some debates about that, going back to the origins and what role Bookerism has in its platform, but it comes from the Black proletariat, and its credibility still lies in the Black proletariat, quite frankly. And there's a reason, whether we like it or not, there's a reason why people like Umar Johnson are very popular.
I think that just kind of speaks to the fact that they speak in kind of drama rhetoric, and they might know a few historical facts that maybe average people don't know or aren't aware of. And they've been put on a bit of a pedestal. Ever since I come into this world, if you could recite a little bit of history and you're Black and you have the right kente kind of little kufi on, or if you have a bow tie on, when I was coming up, you definitely got a hell of a lot of respect. We have to remember people like Ice Cube was it Khalid Muhammad on his record, and these are very right-wing views a lot of these cats have. And I get what you're saying, but I also think does it get respect as far as movement building? No, I'm talking about just in the communities where it exists. Does it get respect, or does it get a certain amount of and then people kind of keep on walking?
I think that when you look at the fact that, according to polls of even college-educated Black kids are saying, who do you consider to be the quote-unquote most powerful Black leader, you hear them still saying Louis Farrakhan. Some people will say,
who the hell are these kids? Are they you in a time machine? I'm not trying to like, who the fuck are these kids that know who the hell Louis Farrakhan is?
There's a lot of people, and you go to certain places in the East Coast, they're very popular. Where there's a youth faction of the Nation of Islam.
Louis Farrakhan could have pulled his dick out where I was in New York, and no one would have known whose dick was out in New York. Louis Farrakhan, for a lot of young people, is unknown because the popularity that he had in the 80s and early 90s is gone. And if you're tied to Louis Farrakhan, you are probably our age. Young people don't know Louis Farrakhan.
Let me tell you something. There's definitely a generation of kids who look up to this Umar Johnson. I was talking to who was talking to me about
Umar Johnson. I was talking to Umar today.
No, I was talking to Torre about this.
He's definitely coming in the champagne room.
I was talking to Torre. We were talking to Torre about this. He literally told me that his kids, a lot of the students in his class, believe that their idea of the contemporary black leader of the day was Umar Johnson.
Look, that nigga teaches Negroes from Chicago, so.
But again, but I mean, you have to understand something, man. Let me tell you something. All you got to do is look at the YouTube numbers of the nationalist YouTube shows and watch the black socialists. Yo, ain't nobody trying to rock with black socialists on YouTube.
You can say that about any form of leftist politics. You know who rocks more than those people? People talking about true crime. So does everybody care about true crime?
I mean, and I think looking at, just because we're talking about, someone like Randolph's life could be instructive about, I think, how much these things are just tied to broader political and structural developments. Because Randolph in the 1920s trying to counter Garvey, he even said was just like hopeless. No one was into it. But part of the reason was, he's preaching interracial unionism when it's just not happening. And the unions are not, the AFL is not allowing it. But when does this change? It changes in the 30s and 40s with the CIO, a lot of black union members becoming active. In fact, the CIO kind of becoming synonymous with racial justice in many areas. So I think it kind of just points to it's part of it's just the times, when
I
things
think
are
there's also
ascended.
another point. There's another point, good point as well, Paul. But there's another point is that, listen, it's very compelling for people who are oppressed when you say the white man is the enemy to be like, yeah, I'm down. Whatever you want to, let's go. The white man is the enemy goes a long way in many black species.
Right.
Does it still have the same cachet that it had, 25 years ago?
It goes a long way, man.
Candace Owens can't have a living if the Hodge twins can't exist.
Those cats are not going into the hood except to tell cats to pull up their pants.
If you think this is where I disagree with you. If you think Miami, Florida, that there's not Negroes in the hood that don't dig Candace Owens.
Oh no, let me tell you, that's a good point. That's a very good point. Let me tell you something. This is what's going on with the right, particularly the Candace Owens, the types, the Larry Elder types as well. They realize the disaffection that particularly under 35 black youth have with the Democratic Party, and they're pitching the Republican Party to them. And I'm not saying it's reaching large numbers of young people, but it's reaching more young black people than it is older ones, without a doubt.
The early part of Turning Point USA, when Candace Owens was still a part of it, and she was with Charlie Kirk and them, they would go to the campus and have a room full of the black kids, and they would use a lot of the same Malcolm X rhetoric that the Democrats are keeping you on the plantation.
Yep.
And to turn
white liberal
away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party was literally some uplift, get off the plantation shit.
Yeah.
And that was having a lot of resonance. What was that? Maybe about 7 years ago.
It worked on Kanye.
and I have a sense, and I could be wrong on this, but I feel like as time goes by, these black nationalist ideas, they get more and more vague and kind of just like something in the ether, So I think, today it's kind of melded with like, owning black businesses. Like I kind of vaguely support that, or this like black celebrity or prominent figure. Whereas I think at least you could say even the black nationalists we would criticize of the 60s, I think there was still at least more of like a theoretical heft to it. Many of them were trying to merge it with Marxism, and there was influence from, but today it's sort of just like,
they are
own a black business. There
are different forms of black nationalism.
Right.
You have revolutionary black nationalism, you have classical black nationalism, you have petit bourgeois black nationalism. There are different types of black
But
nationalism.
what's popular right now? Influencer.
What's popular right now is kind of like a kind of black capitalist,
Yes.
racial uplift, respectability politics, kind of classical black nationalism. These kids would mesh very well with old school Garveyism. They would mesh very well with old school NOI politics.
Do you think? And I'd love to get Paul's opinion on this as a millennial. Do you think these people are using kind of the hip hop music of today and like pointing to this as why I don't know if you've seen, I don't know how much black right wing YouTube you watch, Pascal or Paul, but I've seen them in a little bit that unfortunately I have viewed. Point to like, what's the song, Toussaint, that you like so much about your butthole colors?
Oh,
what's the artist name?
Is that Sexy Red?
Paul knows it. See, young people. Yeah, Paul goes, oh, you mean,
Pound Town
thing. Yeah.
They love pointing to that shit as like, well, there's a degradation in black society. We need to get back to.
Yes, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. There's a new spin. I've been watching these developments online, right? There's a new spin of using respectability politics. It's fascinating to see the conservatism. They use respectability politics and they merge it with like, it was the welfare and the Great Society that destroyed the black family. That shtick, you get that as well. Even though the rate of black poverty decreased precipitously right after the Great Society, and black unemployment was literally off the meat racks in the 60s because of deindustrialization that had nothing to do with the Great Society. Yeah. But I digress. But the larger point is that you get a lot of that. Umar is very into that shtick as well, and it's merged with this kind of like hip hop capitalism. You know who went to that Invest Fest thing? Robert Smith, the wealthiest black man in America. So you have this very intentional fusion of, and none of this is new. If you look at classical black nationalism going back to Garveyism, this stuff has been done before, but it's all being recycled, I would argue, largely because many people don't have a lot of political memory and they're not reading about the way this stuff panned out. And it's very common because I can tell you right now, revolutionary black nationalism doesn't have as much of a following as this stuff does, as it's being pushed with the hip hop beat.
I mean, there's also a sexism and a serious need to scold women. And you have the female rappers, the ones who are, in various states of undress, kind of teed up to go against each other, to go against the Fresh and Fit and all the podcasts with all the guys who scold the women, but secretly really want to have sex with them.
And I think
someone's bringing about how Malcolm X spoke at the Socialist Workers' Party. Listen, post-Hodge Malcolm X, 64, 65, is not pre-Hodge Malcolm X. Right. Malcolm X was clearly advocating socialism before he died, as was Dr. King.
And, this is kind of an interesting biographical point from Adolph Reed's life, but around this time, Reed was flirting with the Socialist Workers' Party while he was in college, and he said, they basically were trying to blend Marxism with black nationalism, and he says it took me a year to figure out that shit doesn't work. But that's kind of an interesting period there. But I was also going to say, I think why some of this stuff is popular as well, and meaning like this black nationalism distilled in different forms, whether it's through hip hop or whatever, is like it doesn't take any sort of like political or programmatic commitment. It's not like you don't have to show up to any meetings or plan a strategy or make certain sacrifices. So you can kind of like consume it and digest it, and it doesn't really require you to do anything.
That's kind of my point with it, right? It's just, look at these women out here dressed like hoes. Look at these dudes out here talking about killing each other.
Or it's like,
put a suit on again.
I want to own a business anyway, so like I can just meld that into
buy up the block. Yeah. And they're 304 girls. They're not hoes.
Oh, this is a great story.
304 girls?
Because when you type it into a calculator and turn it upside down, it spells hoe.
Calculator?
Yes.
You didn't know how to leave pager messages?
The nerds that we're talking about. This is calculator.
Calculator.
So when you turn it upside down, it spells hoe. You don't call them hoes, you call them 304 girls, damn it.
That's the worst thing.
I got a great story about black capitalism and black nationalism. Can I read it? Can I indulge you? Can you guys indulge me for a couple of minutes?
Sure, it can't be too long.
All right. This is from a book that's recently, from the author of a book that I actually purchased today, Keenan Malik, who has this new book about race and class that everyone's telling me is very good. But one of the stories I tell in the book is about a sanitation workers strike in New Orleans. In May 2020, sanitation workers walked out on strike because of poverty, low wages, and lack of safety equipment during the COVID pandemic, as well as the refusal to recognize the union. Nearly all the workers were black, and so were the employers. As a part of its anti-racist drive, New Orleans had outsourced its sanitation work to a black-owned company. The sanitation workers came out on strike 3 weeks before George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. They then remained on strike throughout the summer, and a wave of protests which swept through America, and the world brought racism and black lives to the forefront of global consciousness. But Black Lives Matter meant something very different on the two sides of the picket line. There was one black union leader who said at the time that black exploitation does not end because the company is black owned. And despite that year being the year of Black Lives Matter, the black sanitation workers were forced back to work by September, having won virtually none of their demands. The black employers won, the black workers lost. The idea that there's a common identity only reinforces the power of black elites and diminishes the voices of black workers. It's a lazy way of looking at the world, which is very useful for middle-class minorities, but does disservice to the majority of minority people who happen to be working class.
And that kind of reminds me of Atlanta in 1977. The
garbage workers.
Right. The mayor, I'm forgetting his name. Made our first black mayor. All black sanitation union. He breaks the strike, and guess who also was praising the mayor's actions? Martin Luther King Sr. came out.
Andrew Young as well.
Yeah. So, one thing I also want to say, ironically, this talk about welfare state destroyed the Great Society, destroyed the black family sort of thing. What's kind of ironic is that I would argue, those Great Society policies were also partly motivated by this idea that welfare has destroyed the black family. There's something wrong with the black family, because a lot of these policies were more so stimulated towards we need to get the poor motivated, and that's why, I don't think the Great Society worked like the Freedom Project would have.
You know what one of the biggest problems of it's the black family that's the problem crap that these people, it totally absolves capitalism.
Well, that's Moynihan's whole thing, right? The problem with these people. And I think Paul lays that out very well in his piece, where he talks about at a moment where after these bills are passed and black people are starting to exit the South again, into the major urban core, because that's where all the jobs are. That's where the factory jobs are. Even in a place like where I'm from, California, was the number 2 place of car manufacturing at one point in time. That's why there's a city called the City of Industry. But as these jobs start to get offshored, and then also in places like California, where you get legislation that stops the flow, the legal flow of immigration at one point in time, you start to see these jobs go away for a lot of black people. Also, you have automation coming into play for a lot of these factories as well, that kills the urban core. And Paul mentions this in his piece. I think you said that these mayors, because we start to get black mayors in the late 60s and early 70s of these, very economically depressed areas like Gary, Indiana, and I think Detroit. Who was the second black mayor? Was it Detroit? That's count.
There was Carl Stokes, the first one in Cleveland, I believe.
Cleveland.
Also in Cleveland, and we have what's his name in Detroit? I forget.
And then Hatcher.
We had one in Newark. We had an early one in Newark too.
Yeah.
But these are all areas that, like, still to this day are not. They're still economically depressed cities because the industries that were in them at one point in time are gone.
Right.
And these black mayors were kind of, here you go, fix it. And they, even if they had leftist leaning policies, there was only so much they were going to be able to do. And you kind of hit on that a little bit in your piece, if you wanted to, talk about that before we go.
Yeah, and the freedom budget was the direct counter to the Great Society. So the freedom budget, which they unveiled in 1966 and were fighting for, that was essentially, social democracy in the United States. Full employment, universal housing, universal health care, a form of UBI as well for people who can't work, growing union density. Because that was precisely the point, was that, this Great Society thing is focused on motivating poor people to not be poor, or training them for jobs that increasingly don't even exist anymore. Whereas the freedom budget approach is saying, no, we have to have government intervention to provide these jobs and social welfare. And one era this was motivated by was the 1940s, which was actually one of the best decades for Black workers economically. And during that decade, they really started to close the gap between Black workers and white workers income-wise. And the reason was you basically had full employment, largely due to the wartime mobilization. Unions were kind of like hitting their peak then. And that was kind of like, I think that was like a perfect example of like, this is what is really going to create economic progress for Black workers. If we can do kind of what we did during World War II, but during peacetime and for peacetime methods, that's what the freedom budget was all about. And I think even the dip in poverty you actually did see after the Great Society, I actually think that was kind of more because of just generally there was low unemployment. And I think more so New Deal policies that were expanded and things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. So I think the Great Society programs really actually didn't work that much. I think they were impactful in the sense of creating more public sector jobs that many Black workers got and that were more stable, better jobs. But, and this is another kind of irony of history where, 1966, the freedom budget is unveiled the same year the Black Panther Party starts. And then, in most people's minds, like, oh yeah, the Black Panthers are like, and the Black Power generally, that's like the real radical stuff.
Yeah.
But if you, again, look at the program, the freedom budget would have been the greatest redistribution of wealth and power ever in this country. And some of it, a lot of their program is kind of mirrored by the Black Panther Party program, just stated in a different way. Or you have these like Black Power conferences that happen in the mid and late 60s, and you look at their platforms and it's just like Black cooperatives, more Black businesses, / enforce existing civil rights legislation. So if you really look at the substance, and again, I think it's partly because Barry Rustin dressed up in a suit, had this like weird British accent, same thing with Randolph, like it comes off as like moderate aesthetically, whereas the Panthers seem hyper radical. But I think if you look at the actual program and its implications, it was far more radical.
I think another factor is the fact that the concept of multiracial coalitions is very allergic to a lot of Black nationalist types. They're like, oh, why we gotta work with the white man? No, why you trust those devils? No, that.
And Rustin had a prescient point about the Panthers when they first emerged, where he kind of predicted like they're going to be isolated and repressed. Now he was of course not saying he wanted them to be repressed, but he was saying like at the end of the day, they're still going to be very disconnected by most Black working people who are not about to take up a gun and do what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And it's going to create the groundwork for them to be isolated and repressed as they were. And, and it's also helpful to remember, and this is not, I'm not trying to like praise the NAACP as this great organization, but, they always had a larger membership than the Panthers, as an example. You want to talk about an actual constituency. And obviously the Panthers did have members too, and in certain cities were quite large, but I think it kind of gets overstated, and I think he kind of saw the writing on the wall. If you're not able to maintain this broad coalition, and then you start doing stuff like getting in gunfights with cops, like we know what's going to happen here. It's not going to end well.
Well, there was an attempt to make coalitions by certain chapters of the Black Panthers, particularly in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Even nationally, there was an attempt to make. They accepted coalitions as a national organization as the politics of the movement evolved. But I also agree with you that a lot of that initial kind of posturing and militancy would preclude a kind of broad scale coalition amongst all levels of Black society, and it would breed isolation by not even so much the white power elite, but the traditional Black political class as well, which actually happened in many ways. Even though that got better towards the beginning of the 70s. So I think you're right in that regard. But again, one of the reasons why I'm not absolutely despondent on Black Power and particularly Black Panther Party is that I respect and admire them for maintaining a class critique of particularly Black elites and how Black people function in society, for understanding the implements of socialism, Marxism, and I think Black internationalism is important if done strategically correctly, not in a way that fetishizes internationalism without having a working class practice domestically. But I personally think many things were better in terms of the consciousness of Black people when they understood what was going on in the world relative to their position in America than the kind of ridiculous isolationism that became popularized in the 90s and the early 2000s particularly. And now all of that left politics, whether we like it or not, internationalism, leftism, Marxism, socialism, social democracy, whatever you want to call it, is all out the window for the majority of Black folk in America.
You think so?
You don't think that most Black people?
I think most people, regardless of ethnicity, don't really give that much of a damn about it. But and then I have definitely critiques on the people that claim to be whatever they claim to be. But I don't know. I don't think.
I think one.
Go ahead.
Maybe
Paul.
one hope is that, and I think I touch on the pieces like. Again, do most people like actively see themselves as like, yes, I'm a socialist or I'm a social democrat? Probably not. But the fact that despite all the noise, Black people overall were actually largely supportive of Sanders, 35 and younger. He actually did best among Black people. He was second overall. And that is kind of consistent, I think, throughout history.
Black union density is very high. It's the highest in the country.
Right.
I think getting people in general to kind of look at the world beyond simply electoralism. I think it starts there, right? Because I don't know too many Black people that just walk around saying, "I'm a Democrat. Hi, I'm John the Democrat."
Right. And that's another important. This is the tragedy of like decline of unions and civil society. Nelson Lichtenstein has a great book, State of the Union. It's kind of like broad labor history, and he makes a good point about the CIO unions of the 30s and 40s. I mean, were really also great civic instruments, especially for, of course, Black workers, but also recent European immigrants who were also disenfranchised in their own way. And his unions were also like civic schools and sites of engagement in that way that were really important beyond just the economics. And that's also what we lose when unions are destroyed and all these other aspects of civil society.
And on that note, his piece is linked in the description to the show.
It's a very good piece, Paul, by the way.
Thank you.
His name is Paul Prescod. He writes for Jacobin when he's not organizing unions. My name is Jason Miles. You can catch me in the Champagne Room with M. Toussaint. Pascal, you're going to be joining us in the Champagne Room?
I'll think about it.
Okay, look at that. This is what I have to deal with superstars.
I got to watch the end of this Eagles game.
Well, yeah, I know you're going to watch. I'm not even going to ask you, Paul, because I know the Eagle, Jalen Hurts performing for you. So I'm not even going to bother asking you. It's football season. I get it.
A real Black nationalist hero, Jalen Hurts.
Can Jalen Hurts punch Umar Johnson in Philadelphia and get away with it?
He could. I mean, he's probably more popular.
In front of 25 white cops, too.
I mean, we could get Jalen Hurts to adopt a socialist perspective. I mean, he would get elected mayor and Congress. So
I believe that.
That's what I'm investing my time in. What are you doing?
If he is the anti-Donovan McNabb, as someone that grew up in Philly,
I have complicated feelings about McNabb, but it's complicated.
But I think he's an anti-McNabb. Look, that is a conversation for another time. I thought his name was
Got you again.
Zine Magubani is going down in TIR history for that mistake.
Love it.
And we were speaking with Paul Prescod, not to Ray Reid.
The other lights.
Little known fact.
The other light skinned guy. The only reason why they don't mistake Cedric is because Cedric has no hair. They think all of them look alike. We'll see you in the champagne room, and we are
Out.